Kertisha Mourning was a Long Island teenager with a bright future.
Homecoming queen, beautiful young girl, great student.
And Kalila Taylor was the friend she'd known her entire life.
She did her hair for the prom.
But when the homecoming queen's brutal murder shocked their quiet community.
You don't need to stab someone 96 times to kill them.
It was a stabbing upon stabbing upon stabbing.
What seemed like a straightforward investigation.
This may have been a lover's triangle type situation.
Would take a bizarre turn.
Her accusations were just off the wall.
There were claims that the police had a machine that made clones.
And before it was all over, people wouldn't just be questioning Kalila's innocence. They'd be doubting her sanity.
She felt that she had now a lizard inside of her. If that's your reality, then all bets are off.
Riverhead, New York, March 1st, 1996. It was around 6 o'clock on Friday morning, the start of another long day for the commuters in this quiet town at the eastern end of Long Island, more than an hour from Manhattan. But the family of Kertisha Mourning had been up for hours. The 17-year-old senior at Riverhead High had been missing since the previous afternoon.
She did not come home from school, which was not the norm.
And at 1 o'clock that morning, after hours of anxious waiting, Kertisha's family had reported her missing.
There was a certain element of fear. This is not a place where kids just disappear, especially kids who are excellent students, beautiful homecoming queen.
The missing persons case focused on Riverhead High School because that was the last place that she was seen.
But while the police went to school that morning, the family fanned out, calling or dropping by friends of Kertisha's, hoping someone had seen or heard from the missing teen.
Why she just disappeared was definitely a major mystery.
She didn't seem like the kind of kid who would run away.
One of the first people Kertisha's family contacted hoping for some news was 18-year-old Kalila Taylor.
Her sisters came to my house, right? Asked about 6 o'clock in the morning, asked, did we see her sister?
The girls were friends and the families were friends too.
But unfortunately for Kertisha's family, neither Kalila nor her mother could tell them the missing teenager's whereabouts.
We didn't know where she was.
But as the entire community united in the search for a missing girl, police would uncover clues that led them back to Kertisha's friend Kalila, and a revelation that would tear the two families apart. Like many in Riverhead, Kertisha Mourning had lived in the Long Island community her entire life.
Many of these families have been there generations. It's a very tight-knit bedroom community, hard-working, working-class people.
And Kertisha had known Kalila Taylor her entire life, too.
Their families had a long history. The two mothers went all the way back to high school.
Their mothers remained friends after school.
Before, Kertisha was born, before Kalila was born, we all used to hang around together. I used to let her borrow outfits, to go out and stuff.
And once Kertisha and Kalila came along, the little girls essentially grew up together.
The families used to go to barbecues together. They used to be fairly close.
Kertisha grew into a smart and attractive teenager, becoming a star student at Riverhead High.
She was the homecoming queen. She was popular in school.
She was also ambitious, with a bright future ahead of her.
She was a great student, a great kid, had ambitions to go on to college.
And she was already pursuing her nurse's aide certification at the BOCES Center.
The BOCES Center is a vocational center located right next door to Riverhead High School.
She had aspirations to becoming a nurse and possibly going on to medical school.
And the pretty teenager was successful outside the classroom as well. In early 1996, she had begun dating someone new.
Carl Brown had given Kertisha flowers and a balloon on St. Valentine's Day.
But there was one problem with Kertisha's new romance. 22-year-old Carl was the ex-boyfriend of her longtime friend, Kalila Taylor.
My daughter wasn't going to him anymore. because they had broke up.
Like Kertisha, Kalila came from a tight-knit working-class family.
We always had family gatherings and stuff. Every Sunday after church, dinner was at my house, every Sunday.
And while she was never homecoming queen, the pretty teenager was popular at Riverhead High.
She was very, very popular. She was. She won Best Dress one year, and she also won Best Smile.
She was actively involved in extracurricular activities, too.
She did band, she was in step, a lot of stuff.
But her passion was singing, and she dreamed of someday having a recording career.
She sang in the church. She was a very good singer. Mary J. Blige. That's what some people used to call her as a nickname.
But despite being involved and popular, school wasn't always easy for Kalila.
She did have some disciplinary problems in school.
She began to manifest some behavioral problems.
The causes of Kalila's behavior and discipline problems weren't too unusual for a teenage girl.
Issues of jealousy, how people thought of her, how she thought of people, relationships with people that she liked.
Mostly it seemed like typical teenage drama.
The trouble was that Kalila had a tendency to take her teenage drama to the next level, the physical level.
There were incidents of violence with Kalila where she would engage in fights with other girls.
A lot of people was jealous of her, the way she dresses and the way she do things. A lot of people wanted to, fight her too.
By the time she was in high school, a lot of people thought Kalila was becoming a troublemaker.
Fighting wasn't the only thing that earned her a reputation either. Like many teenagers, Kalila also liked to have a good time.
She used to go out a lot, which I didn't like. She used to go out clubbing a lot, which wasn't a good idea. But, that's how some teenagers are.
But in the summer of 1993, Kalila's partying came to an end. The 16-year-old told her mother that she was pregnant. The baby's father was 19-year-old Carl Brown.
Kalila and Carl had been dating on and off since she was about 14 years old.
In February of 1994, Kalila gave birth to a baby boy, but she didn't drop out of school.
She was determined to stay in school and to get an education.
She's a very tough girl.
And by the time Kalila graduated in June of 1995, it appeared that she had gotten her life back on track. Not only had she earned her diploma, she'd also received a nurse's aide certification from the BOCES Technical Center. But despite all that effort, Kalila's career never took off.
Her life stalled a little bit because she did have a child and did not go on to college.
Instead, she worked a series of fast food jobs, living at home to save money while she focused on raising her baby alone.
She was a very good mom. She always kept her son dressed really nice, always kept him fed.
And by December of 1995, 18-year-old Kalila had managed to save up enough money to move out of her mother's house.
She finally got her own place.
Carl Brown, Kalila's ex-boyfriend and the father of her 18-month-old son, even moved in after New Year's.
At the beginning of 1996, it looks like things are looking up for Kalila.
Unfortunately, Kalila's brief foray into family life barely began before it came to an abrupt end.
About 2 weeks after Carl moved in, they got into a huge fight and Carl moved out.
Unable to afford living on her own after the breakup, Kalila moved back in with her family. And within a few weeks, Carl was dating someone new.
That had to sting. Within a couple of weeks of your man leaving you, he's already taking up with another woman.
And to make matters worse, it was someone Kalila knew well. Kertisha Mourning. On Thursday, February 29th, Kertisha had been invited to speak at the orientation session at the BOCES Center, talking up the nurse's aide program to students who might be interested in studying for their certification.
She was asked to go to the orientation by her nursing teacher because she was the #1 kid in her class.
The presentation was over a little after 10 o'clock. And when she was done, Kertisha headed out to make the short walk back to class at Riverhead High.
On this day, because it was orientation day, there was not the normal stream of 30 or 40 kids walking between buildings. Kertisha Mourning left that building at about 10:25 a.m. and was the only person from Riverhead High School leaving the building at that time.
And a few minutes after she walked out of the BOCES Center, bundled into her leather jacket on the brisk February day, Kertisha Mourning disappeared. Coming up, the community bands together to find the missing teenager.
The whole town turned out.
But will the search come to a tragic end?
This girl is probably not going to come back alive.
It was a little after midnight on March 1st, 1996, when Kertisha Mourning's mother reported her missing.
Her mother waited until about 1 o'clock in the morning, and she called the police to officially report her daughter missing.
The 17-year-old had disappeared more than 12 hours earlier after giving a presentation at the BOCES Center, a vocational school in Riverhead, New York.
That school is catty-corner to Riverhead High School, so the students from Riverhead High School that would go to BOCES would walk.
This is at about 10:30 in the morning on the 29th of February. And that's the last time anyone saw Kertisha.
By morning, the local police had begun investigating the case as a possible runaway.
And that was not a very good assessment at the time. She did not have any background or history of runaways. She was a good, solid student, and there was no reason in the world for her to run away.
Kertisha's family agreed. That morning, while the police made a cursory search of the school grounds and conducted a handful of interviews at Riverhead High, the family began contacting Kertisha's friends, hoping that someone had information about the missing teenager.
She was a homecoming queen, and it was not normal for a kid like that to go missing.
And one of the first people that Kertisha's family turned to was 18-year-old Kalila Taylor, a recent graduate of Riverhead High.
Kalila was a year older, graduated a year ahead of Kertisha. They had known each other and they were friends.
Kalila told the family she had no idea where Kertisha was. But the news was more than enough to get Kalila's mother worried.
I said, we dealing with a devil, you know what I'm saying? I was like telling my daughters, y'all better be careful, you know, it was just crazy.
And the fear only intensified that afternoon when the first clue turned up.
A woman walking through the wooded area by the schools found a bag of nursing clothing and a backpack that belonged to Kertisha Mourning.
Kertisha's family feared the worst.
Possibly she was abducted, or maybe even worse than that.
There was a fear that something bad had happened to her.
Kertisha's family members weren't the only ones afraid either. Once her backpack was found, the story spread to the local media, and news of the teen's mysterious disappearance shook tight-knit Riverhead to its core.
Kertisha Mourning, homecoming queen, beautiful young girl, great student, bright future, who just suddenly went missing. There was real panic in the community.
And over the next several days, the search for the missing teen intensified.
The family and the police department put up missing persons posters throughout the town.
Stopping people, lines of cars, and like, have you seen her?
There was even searches done by canines, dogs, by the New York State Police.
But despite an all-out effort by the entire town, the authorities were no closer to finding the missing teen.
Nobody really knew what happened to the poor girl.
There were plenty of rumors, though.
Some people in the community figured that she ran off with a man.
There were several sightings, or alleged sightings, of Kertisha throughout Suffolk County.
The police diligently followed up on every lead, but none of them panned out.
All of these sightings proved to be false.
And on March 20th, after Kertisha had been missing for 3 weeks, the local police quietly contacted the Suffolk County Police Homicide Division.
The Suffolk County Police Department covers murder cases throughout the entire counties. Our department was notified that this girl that's missing, Kertisha Mourning, is probably not going to come back alive.
Suffolk County didn't open an official investigation just yet, The call was a courtesy to put the local homicide cops on notice. But 5 days later, on March 25th, they would be needed in Riverhead. It was early that Monday evening when a babysitter who lived near Riverhead High brought 2 boys out to the track behind the school.
When the weather started turning nice, she brought the kids onto the school property and they would run around.
While the children played, the woman walked around the grounds. And in the patch of woods near the school, she spotted something buried in the leaves.
She saw what she thought was a leather jacket.
But when the woman went to pick up the jacket, she discovered something else.
In that jacket was Katisha Mourning.
The woman who found the body called for help. And it wasn't long after that the area was swarming with police, including the investigators from the Suffolk County Homicide Squad.
And from that point on, the Suffolk County Homicide Squad maintained jurisdiction over the investigation.
And the condition of Katisha's body left no doubt it was a homicide. The high school senior was covered in stab wounds.
There's a knife wound through her cheek, and then there's clusters of stab wounds to the top of her head and to the back of her neck.
There were also defensive wounds on Katisha's hands and arms.
It was a ferocious, brutal attack.
And as the forensics team searched the area, they found more evidence of a struggle.
The earring matched one that was still in Katisha's ear, so the theory is it had been torn out during the attack.
Also nearby, the investigators recovered a silver necklace.
There was evidence of a struggle. That necklace found in the same area, as well as a little bit of blood, and then further down along the fence line where the main attack took place.
Incredibly, Katisha's body was in an area that both the police and school officials had already searched.
Remember also, this is February and March. For a while there was snow on the ground and on her. On the other hand, there was a lot of attention on this girl. They searched that very field with a lot of cops, and it seemed surprising that they didn't find her.
In fact, even the search dogs had failed to find her.
Turns out these dogs from New York State Police were actually dogs who were trained to detect human beings who were alive, not cadavers.
Soon after neighbors spotted the swarm of blue lights flashing behind the school, the news spread throughout the close-knit community. After almost a month, Katisha had finally been found.
This was like a time bomb waiting to go off, her being found. And being found right where she was pretty much last seen was a total shock to the community. And as a result, within an hour or two, the crime scene was getting a little bit out of control. There was approximately 250 people there from the community just wanting to know what was going on and wanting to see her.
What kind of animal could have did that to my baby?
Police were asking the same question. Why would someone so brutally attack the popular homecoming queen? When the autopsy was conducted the next day, the medical examiner counted nearly 100 separate wounds on Katisha's body.
The doctor said it was the totality of the trauma that killed Katisha Mourning. There was not one stab wound that they could say definitively would have killed her. There was just the totality of the shock to the body and the trauma that killed her.
But while the medical examiner couldn't say exactly which wound had killed Katisha, the investigators figured that the vicious nature of the attack did suggest something about her killer.
They believed it was someone who knew Katisha who killed her, because that kind of ferocity you wouldn't see in a random attack.
There was an emotional attachment to this murder.
That person was driven by a huge well of anger. I mean, that's definitely overkill. You don't need to stab someone 96 times to kill them.
And by the time they had the autopsy results, the investigators believed they had a possible lead.
There was some rumors that this may have been a lover's triangle type situation.
After all, Katisha's new boyfriend, Carl Brown, had only recently broken up with his last girlfriend, 19-year-old Kalila Taylor.
Some people were aware that she had expressed hard feelings toward Kertisha for dating her ex.
Coming up, police search for a jilted lover.
The last people who saw Kertisha alive saw her arguing with a girl.
And a lucky find strengthens their case.
He asked me if I could identify a piece of jewelry that was in a photograph.
On March 25, 1996, 25 days after she had mysteriously disappeared from the campus of her Riverhead, New York high school, the body of missing teenager Kertisha Mourning was finally found. The popular homecoming queen had been stabbed repeatedly.
This was not just a stabbing. It was a stabbing upon stabbing upon stabbing.
Tipped off by friends and family, police discovered that Kertisha had been dating the ex-boyfriend of her longtime friend, Kalila Taylor.
Carl Brown was the father of Kalila's 2-year-old son.
Was it possible that the 19-year-old had stabbed her friend to death in a jealous rage? Not according to Kalila's mother.
Her and Carl had a son together, but their relationship had been over for a long time.
But when the investigators pulled Kalila's police record, they weren't so sure.
Kalila Taylor had a history of violence.
Not just any violence either.
She was on probation for an assault, which involved a stabbing.
The incident had occurred 2 years earlier, in 1994. And it was self-defense, according to Kalila's mom.
But when somebody messed with her, she did defend herself.
Besides, there was a big difference between a minor assault and a brutal murder. The detectives needed more proof. They spent the next 2 days conducting extensive interviews at Riverhead High. And they found 3 people who remembered seeing Kertisha out on the school grounds, walking back to class from the Bosey Center on the morning of February 29th. And according to all 3 of the witnesses, Kertisha hadn't been alone.
The last people who saw Kertisha alive saw her arguing with a girl.
And the witnesses, a phys ed teacher, a teacher's aide, and the girlfriend of one of the school's employees all agreed. That girl looked like Kalila Taylor.
All 3 of those witnesses picked Kalila's picture out of Riverhead's high school yearbook.
One witness did describe Kalila Taylor as being animated while she was speaking to Kertisha, and I can only theorize that at some point a knife was pulled, which caused Kertisha to flee, and unfortunately, instead of fleeing towards the school, she fled away from the school and was subsequently caught and murdered.
What about the man they were allegedly fighting over? When the police spoke to Carl Brown, he told them about breaking up with Kalila after their last fight turned violent.
According to Carl, the fight ended when Kalila stabbed him.
The wound wasn't serious, and Carl had never reported Kalila to the police. But 2 stabbing incidents in her past and witness accounts of her argument with Kertisha were more than enough to make Kalila a prime suspect. On April 4th, the investigators brought Kalila in for questioning.
They went to Kalila's workplace at Wendy's in Riverhead, picked her up and brought her down to homicide, and they questioned her at length.
She waived her rights and allowed us to interview her.
During the interview, the teenager repeatedly denied having anything to do with Kertisha's murder.
She said numerous times, "Oh my God, you're not going to pin this on me."
Instead, Kalila insisted that she and Kertisha had been friends.
Kalila's version is that she had no problem with Kertisha at all.
She told us that she did her hair for the prom the prior year.
And as far as Kertisha dating Carl, Kalila told the investigators she didn't care.
She said she was done with him, it didn't matter to her.
My daughter didn't have to be jealous of anybody.
Besides, according to Kalila, there was no way she could have killed Kertisha.
She says that at the time that killing happened, between 10:30 and 11 a.m. that morning, she was on her way to her job at Wendy's.
And she was adamant that whoever the witnesses saw arguing with Kertisha wasn't her.
She denied any involvement. She hadn't been with her, she hadn't killed her.
Finally, after 6 long hours, the interview was over.
The police did not get any confession or admission.
It was a joint decision between the police department and the district attorney's office to let her go and continue the investigation.
But even though they let Kalila go, the interview was far from a total loss for the investigators.
The important part of that interview turned out to be, we noticed some injuries on her hands.
Specifically, they were cuts. And since they were mostly healed, they looked to be several weeks old.
In the web between her thumb and forefinger was a healed slice. In my opinion, was caused during the attack. The knife rode up on her hand and cut her.
So before they had let Kalila go that afternoon, the investigators took photographs of the suspicious scars and a sample of her blood.
When she was found, Kertisha's clothing was covered in blood. So the hope was some of that blood could be matched back to Kalila.
The blood sample went to the crime lab, and the investigators went to Wendy's to check out Kalila's alibi.
The day of the murder, she was scheduled to work at Wendy's at 12 noon. If the murder happened at 10:25, which is the last time Kertisha was seen, she would have plenty of time to go home, take a shower, get changed, and go to Wendy's.
Contrary to her claim, Kalila could have stabbed Kertisha in the woods behind Riverhead High. And with a little luck, the blood on Kertisha's clothes could put her there. But even as they awaited the test results, the investigators found another surprising piece of evidence that could potentially place Kalila at the scene of the crime. While searching Kalila's police records, the investigators had come across a report involving yet another fight.
Kalila was assaulted in October of 1995, approximately 4 months before the murder.
Only this time it had been Kalila who ended up stabbed.
Kalila did file a police report.
The Riverhead Town Police Department took photographs of her injuries.
And when the detectives investigating Kertisha's murder saw those photographs of Kalila, they noticed something awfully familiar: her necklace.
It looked just like the necklace found near Kertisha's body.
But was it the same necklace?
As part of the investigation, I went to a jeweler who was very experienced in doing comparisons for insurance companies.
He asked me if he could show me a couple photographs and if I could identify a piece of jewelry that was in a photograph. I said yes.
And when he compared the necklace found near Kertisha's body with the one in the photographs,
there were certain defects, certain points of damage on the necklace that were unique, both in the necklace that he examined and in photographs of that necklace on Kalila Taylor.
which could mean only one thing in the jeweler's expert opinion.
The two of them were identical.
She was wearing that same necklace.
But would the jeweler's testimony be enough to convince a jury?
It was a circumstantial case, albeit a very strong circumstantial case.
What the investigators needed was something more definitive, something that could directly tie Kalila to Kertisha's murder. The trouble was that even after months of searching, the necklace was as close as they had come.
The murder weapon in this case was never found.
And without a murder weapon, an eyewitness coming forward, or a confession, the entire case hinged upon finding a match between Kalila's blood and the blood on Kertisha's clothing.
The necklace wouldn't necessarily prove Kalila killed Kertisha. It could have been dropped some other time. However, if it's her blood found on Kertisha's clothing, that's a lot harder to explain away.
There's no explanation for that to be there other than that she killed her.
But an arrest would have to wait until police had enough evidence to prove it. The year after Kertisha's murder had been a tense time for Kalila.
She said, "Mom, you know they try to say that I killed this girl?"
The accusation was enough to end the years of friendship between the Taylor and the Mourning families.
After we let Kalila go and it became known that she was the #1 suspect in this case, there was some incidents between the families. Nothing major, but just some verbal things going back and forth.
It's hard. We was very good friends.
However, despite all the drama, Kalila had done her best to move on with her life. In the spring of 1997, she had started a new job to support herself and her 3-year-old son.
She was working with disabled children.
But more than a year after Kertisha's murder, police had finally received the DNA results. Not only was some of the blood on Kertisha's clothing the same type as Kalila's, the DNA was a match too.
Kalila Taylor's blood was on Kertisha's boot, was on Kertisha's pants.
On June 9, 1997, the Suffolk County Police placed Kalila under arrest for murder. Coming up, Kalila claims the police are conspiring against her.
It was just a big setup.
And then things get strange.
There were claims that the police had a machine that made clones.
On August 25, 1999, Kalila Taylor went on trial in the Suffolk County Courthouse in Riverhead, New York. The 22-year-old was charged with second-degree murder in the brutal stabbing death of a girl she had known her entire life, 17-year-old Kertisha Mourning.
The trial took place just a mile or two from the high school where this happened.
It had been more than 3 years since the former homecoming queen had first disappeared, but the emotions still ran high. And some people didn't want to believe that a young woman they all knew was capable of such brutality.
Many people in Riverhead supported the Taylor family and supported Kalila's innocence, and many people in the community supported the Mourning family and the loss of their child.
The courtroom was packed as the prosecutor delivered her opening statement, accusing Kalila of murder driven by jealousy.
She was a very possessive individual and a very jealous individual, and was still very upset that Carl Brown broke up with her, and very upset that Kertisha Mourning did not talk to her about dating Carl Brown.
According to the prosecution, Kalila had confronted Kertisha. They had argued, and things got out of hand.
Kalila pulled a knife on Kertisha. She had a history and prior arrests for slashing girls with razor blades and stabbing.
However, Kalila's criminal history was only one part of the prosecution's case. 3 witnesses took the stand and testified that they had seen someone who looked like Kalila arguing with Kertisha on the morning of the murder.
It was clear from the witnesses that she was definitely on the school grounds at around 10:25 that morning.
Then there was the necklace found not far from Kertisha's body. The jeweler consulted by the investigators testified that it was the same one Kalila had been photographed wearing before the murder.
It is physically impossible for the necklace that was presented to me to have anything other than the necklace that was in that photograph.
And her necklace wasn't all that Kalila had left behind, according to the prosecution. They wrapped their case by presenting the DNA test results, confirming that Kalila's blood had been found on Kertisha's clothing.
They made the argument that Kalila must have cut her hand on the knife during the stabbing.
When it was the defense's turn, they argued that the investigators had been too quick to focus on Kalila.
They just took it and ran with it, you know what I'm saying? They didn't even give the people a chance to even do a good investigation or nothing.
In fact, they went so far as to suggest Kalila had been framed.
The defense argued that if there was a homicide, it did not occur on the day that she went missing, that there could have been an abduction and the body was dumped there at a subsequent time.
According to the defense, that was the only way to explain how it had been almost a month before Kertisha's body had been found, only a few hundred yards from where she had last been seen.
There were searches done at Riverhead High School, exhaustive searches, and the body was not recovered.
Just who had killed Kertisha, the defense couldn't say. But when Kalila took the stand on September 28th, she did offer her take on just who was framing her. According to Kalila, it was the police.
It was just a big setup. They had to get somebody for this.
Kalila claimed that was how the necklace had ended up at the crime scene.
Kalila said that police must have bought that necklace and planted it there.
And her DNA on Kertisha's clothing? Kalila had an explanation for that, too.
About a month before the murder, Kalila Taylor and Katisha Mourning were both at the Riverhead Central Hospital.
Kalila Taylor was at the hospital for another violent incident where she was in a fight.
Kalila testified that Katisha had been visiting with her mother, who was sick, and the two friends ran into each other.
The defense argued that Kalila must have bled on Katisha at that time. She must have been wearing the same clothing that she was wearing the day of the homicide.
But when the verdict was read, it was obvious that Kalila's claims had little impact on the jurors. They found her guilty of second-degree murder.
Kalila Taylor was sentenced to a sentence of 25 years to life.
Right, it wasn't fair. It wasn't fair at all.
However, less than 5 years later, it would be Katisha's family arguing that the system was unfair. In April of 2004, the New York Court of Appeals overturned Kalila's conviction.
The reason why it got turned over on appeal was that the judge in the first trial said that DNA was to be taken as direct evidence instead of circumstantial evidence. So on that sort of technicality, it got flipped.
People make the argument that DNA is stronger. I would concur with that argument, but it's still under the law classified as circumstantial evidence.
Soon, the prosecutors and defense attorneys were busy preparing to retry Kalila. And the courthouse was buzzing with speculation about whether she would be fit to stand trial at all. In the 5 years since Kalila had been sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for second-degree murder, she'd had a lot of time on her hands.
She had started writing letters to pretty much everybody involved with the case, including myself, making some disturbing allegations, all that proved to be false.
Kalila even claimed that she was pregnant. Kalila didn't stop there, however. In fact, her accusations went from shocking to downright bizarre, because according to Kalila, she wasn't carrying a baby.
She felt that she had now a lizard inside of her.
There were claims that the police had a machine that made clones from snakes.
She even claimed that it was actually Katisha's clone who had been murdered.
She also claimed I had a death machine where I could kill people and bring them back to life.
Her accusations were off the wall. Not just untrue, but unbelievable.
If that's your reality, then kind of all bets are off.
However, when her conviction was overturned, Kalila's strange new reality also presented an opportunity, one that her defense was quick to seize upon.
I had a forensic psychiatrist appointed by the court to examine her for competency to stand trial.
When I examined her, I felt that she was manifesting some fairly significant signs and symptoms of a psychotic mental disorder.
Because of the stress or whatever she did, just got mentally broke down.
In 2005, the courts declared Kalila unfit to stand trial again and sent her to a state psychiatric hospital.
She spent years being treated, being medicated.
But sending Kalila to the psych ward wasn't the end of the case. If the treatment and medication ever succeeded, the state would move ahead with the retrial.
When you're found incompetent, that's not the end of it. You're examined periodically to see whether you have now recovered to be able to stand trial.
Coming up, will Kalila ever face a retrial?
It didn't seem like she was really mentally there.
Or will her mental state sway the court?
Someone yelled, "This is wrong."
On June 11, 2012, Kalila Taylor was back in a Suffolk County, New York courtroom. It had been 16 years since the brutal murder of Katisha Mourning, and 7 years since Kalila had been found incompetent to stand trial.
A person who is incompetent to stand trial can be treated until that person is competent. And that's what happened with Kalila.
Although when she was found competent in 2010, that still hadn't guaranteed that she would face a jury.
And the court offered Kalila the plea bargain of 18 years to avoid the Mourning family to have to go through the ordeal and the emotions of a second trial.
Kalila's attorney and her family urged her to take the deal, but she refused.
She preferred to go to trial and let the chips fall they may.
And now the 35-year-old was on trial again. Although her appearance in the courtroom left many wondering whether she was really as competent as the court said.
She didn't look like she was really there. You know, she was physically there, but it didn't seem like she was really mentally there.
She seemed confused most of the time.
The prosecution's case was practically a repeat of the first trial.
The prosecution in the case were trying to make the point that all this evidence pointed to Kalila Taylor the first time, and it was all going to point to her again.
And it was more than enough to ensure a conviction. On July 2nd, a jury once again found Kalila guilty of murder.
We all felt, based on what we were given and that DNA evidence, that Kalila, committed this crime.
For Kertisha's family, the long wait for justice was finally over.
Kertisha Sada kind of gave a sigh, a loud sigh of relief, and thank God.
But Kalila's family still believed that she was innocent.
When they read the verdict, someone yelled, "This is wrong."
Any evidence against Kalila they felt was either manufactured or planted by police. They never stopped believing in Kalila's innocence.
She was a good person, I don't believe she done it. I never will believe she done it.
But Kalila's attorney believes that it was the system that failed her.
Kalila is not evil. She is sick. The state should have consented that she was permanently incompetent to stand trial, and she would have been civilly confined to a psychiatric institution where the experts would decide on her release.
However, since she's been found guilty of murder, Kalila is serving 25 years to life in prison. And it will be the parole board that decides when, if ever, she will be released.
Hopefully the parole board will see that this woman is a very violent and dangerous girl and will keep her in prison for a very long time.
Europe's highways never truly sleep. Long after city lights fade behind curtains and apartment windows go dark, streams of trucks continue moving through the night. They cross borders that once divided nations, carrying food, machinery, clothing, fuel, and countless other necessities. From Germany into France, from France into Spain, from Italy back towards Central Europe. Thousands of kilometers of asphalt connect millions of people who will never meet, creating a vast network where movement is constant and anonymity is almost guaranteed. For most people, these roads symbolize commerce and connection. They represent the invisible system that keeps modern life functioning. But hidden within that same system exists another reality, one built on isolation, distance, and the unsettling fact that a person can travel across entire countries without attracting much attention. It is a reality that investigators across Europe would eventually come to know all too well. Because for more than 3 decades, while trucks rolled across international highways and border crossings became increasingly routine, a predator was moving among them. His name was Volker Eckert. To the people who encountered him in everyday life, he appeared unremarkable. He was a truck driver, a man who spent much of his time alone on the road, someone who blended into a profession filled with thousands of other drivers traveling similar routes every day. Yet behind that ordinary exterior was a man who would become one of the most notorious serial killers in modern German criminal history. Authorities would eventually suspect him of involvement in somewhere between 9 and 19. Murders committed across multiple European countries. His victims were discovered in different jurisdictions, investigated by different police agencies, and separated by hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. For years, many of those cases existed as isolated tragedies, individual investigations with no obvious connection to one another. But they were connected. The thread that linked them was a single man who had discovered how easily modern transportation, could conceal violence. The details of the case remain disturbing even today. Investigators would eventually uncover photographs of dead women carefully preserved by the killer. They would find personal belongings taken from victims and kept for years. They would discover locks of hair collected and stored as trophies. And they would learn that the origins of these crimes stretched back much further than anyone had imagined. The story did not begin in adulthood. It did not begin when Volker Eckert became a truck driver. It did not even begin with the murders that would later draw international attention. Instead, the roots of the case reached back into his childhood, into a pattern of behavior that developed years before law enforcement ever knew his name. When investigators eventually reconstructed the timeline of his life, they found a progression that seemed both shocking and deeply unsettling. The warning signs had appeared early. The fantasies had emerged young. The violence had escalated gradually. And then, when he was only 14 years old, someone died. At the time, nobody realized the significance of what had happened. A young girl named Sylvia Unterdorfel lost her life in May of 1974. The circumstances surrounding her death appeared straightforward to investigators of the era. The case was treated as a suicide. Questions remained, but there was no immediate reason to suspect that a teenage classmate had orchestrated the entire scene. As a result, the truth remained hidden. Years passed, then more years, then decades. Meanwhile, Volker Eckert carried a secret that no one around him knew. According to information that would emerge much later, he had already crossed a line from which there would be no return. The consequences of that failure would reverberate across Europe. The significance of Sylvia's death cannot be measured solely by the tragedy itself. It must also be understood in the context of what followed. Because when a person commits a violent act and escapes accountability, something dangerous can happen. The illusion of invulnerability begins to grow. Fear of consequences diminishes. Confidence increases. For investigators examining the case years later, this would become one of the most haunting aspects of the entire story. The first known killing was not followed by immediate capture. It was followed by freedom. And freedom gave the future killer time. Time to develop. Time to refine his behavior. Time to continue. By the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, reports of attacks on women would begin to emerge. Some victims survived. Some provided descriptions. Some escaped what could have become fatal encounters. Each incident offered glimpses into a pattern that authorities had not yet fully understood. A man approaching from behind. A sudden attack. Hands around a throat. A fixation that seemed to extend beyond violence itself. At the center of everything was an obsession that investigators would later identify as one of the defining features of Eckert's criminal behavior. An extreme fixation on women's hair. This obsession had been present since childhood. Over time it evolved. Then it darkened. Eventually it became intertwined with fantasies of domination, control, and death. Years later, when police searched his property, they would discover evidence suggesting that the obsession had never disappeared. Instead, it had accompanied him throughout his life, shaping the crimes that followed and influencing the way he remembered his victims. But none of that was known during the years when Volker Eckert traveled freely across Europe. To law enforcement agencies, the murders appeared disconnected. A victim in France, another in Spain, another in Italy. Different names, different locations, different investigative teams, different files stored in different offices. Yet the killer moved effortlessly between those worlds. His profession made it possible. After serving prison time for an attempted murder conviction in the late 1980s and eventually being released, Eckert would enter a line of work that investigators later described as almost ideal for someone seeking to avoid detection. He became an international truck driver. The job offered constant movement. It offered isolation. It offered access to multiple countries. Most importantly, it allowed him to appear exactly where he was expected to be, on the road. A truck crossing a border raises no alarm. A driver stopping at a rest area attracts little attention. A vehicle appearing in one country today and another country tomorrow is entirely normal. For years, those ordinary realities worked in his favor. The highways became pathways connecting crime scenes separated by geography but united by a single offender. And because many of the victims were women living on the margins of society, their disappearances did not always generate the urgency that might have accompanied other cases. Some were migrants. Some were involved in sex work. Many lived lives that already placed them at heightened risk. Their vulnerability became part of the reason the crimes remained hidden for so long. Yet every victim had a name. Every victim had a story. Every victim mattered. And although the investigation would eventually focus on the man responsible, the true heart of this case lies with the women whose lives were taken and the families left searching for answers. Answers that, in many cases, would take years to emerge. Some answers would never come at all. Because one of the most frustrating aspects of the Volker-Ecker investigation is that it ended before many questions could be resolved. Authorities would eventually arrest him. They would gather evidence. They would obtain confessions. They would begin assembling what appeared to be a vast multinational case. But before a full trial could unfold, the story took another unexpected turn. A turn that would leave investigators, victims' relatives, and entire police agencies wondering how much of the truth had died with the man at the center of it all. The case of Volker-Eckert is not merely the story of a serial killer. It is a story about missed opportunities, fragmented investigations, vulnerable victims, and the challenges of pursuing justice across international borders. It is the story of how a crime committed by a 14-year-old boy remained hidden for decades. It is the story of how a truck driver crossed Europe while carrying secrets no one could see. And it is the story of a trail of victims whose lives deserve to be remembered long after the name of their killer fades from public memory. To understand how this happened, we must return to the beginning, to East Germany, to a young boy growing up in Elsnitz, and to the disturbing obsession that would eventually evolve into one of the most alarming criminal cases modern Europe has ever confronted. Every true crime case begins long before the crime itself. Investigators may discover a body on a particular day. An arrest may happen years later. A trial may eventually reveal hidden facts. But the origins of a case are often buried deep in the past, hidden within moments that seemed insignificant when they first occurred. The story of Volker-Eckert is no exception. To understand how one man would eventually become linked to a series of murders stretching across Europe, investigators had to look backward through decades of his life. What they found was not a sudden transformation, but a gradual progression, one that began in childhood and would continue for more than 30 years. Volker-Eckert was born on July 1st, 1959, in Elsnitz, a town located in what was then East Germany. At the time, nobody could have imagined the role he would one day play in one of Germany's most disturbing criminal cases. Like countless other children growing up in the region, he lived in a society shaped by the political realities of the Cold War. Yet the details that would later attract the attention of investigators had little to do with politics or history. They centered instead on an obsession that appeared unusually early in his life. According to information uncovered during the investigation, Eckert developed a fixation on women's hair while still a child. Between the ages of 6 and 9, he reportedly spent time touching the hair of dolls and examining wigs that belonged to his mother. At first glance, these actions may not have appeared alarming. Children often display curious behaviors that fade with time. But in Eckert's case, the fascination did not disappear. Instead, it grew stronger. As the years passed, the fixation evolved into something much darker. Investigators later learned that touching hair became associated with sexual excitement. This was no longer a harmless childhood interest. It was becoming a central part of his inner world. The obsession followed him as he entered adolescence, a period during which most young people begin forming healthy emotional relationships and social connections. Yet according to later findings, Eckert's thoughts increasingly moved in a different direction. He became more isolated, more withdrawn. Most importantly, his fantasies became violent. Rather than imagining ordinary interactions with girls his age, he reportedly fantasized about controlling them. The fantasies centered on girls with long hair. Investigators later determined that he imagined situations in which victims were unable to resist him. Over time, these fantasies reportedly became increasingly aggressive and disturbing. The progression would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Years later, when detectives attempted to reconstruct the development of his criminal behavior, they saw a pattern that appeared to move from fascination to obsession, from obsession to fantasy, and from fantasy to violence. Then, in 1974, violence became reality. On May 7th of that year, a 14-year-old girl named Sylvia Unterdorfel lost her life. Sylvia was not an anonymous victim. She was not someone randomly encountered on a distant highway. She was a classmate of Volker Eckert. She was a teenager with an entire future ahead of her. Like countless young people, she was navigating school, friendships, and the ordinary experiences of adolescence. Nothing in the available evidence suggests she had any reason to fear the person who would ultimately take her life. According to information later obtained during the investigation, Eckert lured Sylvia to the attic of a building. Once there, he attacked her using a curtain cord. What followed was a desperate struggle. The available facts indicate that Sylvia fought back. She resisted. She attempted to survive. But the attack continued until she died. For Sylvia and her family, the consequences were irreversible. A young life ended at just 14 years old. Yet what happened afterward would shape the future course of the case almost as much as the murder itself. According to later admissions, Eckert spent time stroking Sylvia's hair after her death. Investigators viewed this as a direct expression of the fixation that had been developing for years. The behavior reflected the same obsession that had first appeared during childhood, now combined with lethal violence. Then came the deception. Rather than leaving the scene as it was, Eckert allegedly staged the circumstances to resemble a suicide. The strategy worked. Authorities at the time concluded that Sylvia's death was self-inflicted. No murder investigation focused on Eckert. No arrest followed. No one suspected that a 14-year-old boy was responsible. For decades, the truth remained hidden. When modern investigators later examined the history of the case, they frequently returned to this moment, not only because a murder had gone undetected, but because of what that failure meant for the future. A killer had learned that he could escape. He had crossed a line that few people ever cross, and he had done so without consequences. There was no public exposure, no criminal conviction, no punishment. The lesson was dangerous. For years afterward, Eckert continued living his life while carrying a secret that nobody around him knew. As time passed, troubling patterns began to emerge. Throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Eckert reportedly carried out a series of attacks against young women in Plauen. While these incidents did not always end in death, they demonstrated recurring behaviors that investigators would later recognize as highly significant. The attacks often involved stalking. Victims were approached unexpectedly. Strangulation played a central role. The assaults reflected the same themes of domination and control that had appeared in his earlier fantasies. Most importantly, some victims survived. Survivors occupy a unique place within criminal investigations. They are often the only people capable of describing what happened. Their testimony can provide details unavailable from any other source. In the Eckert case, one survivor would ultimately become instrumental in exposing him. Her name was Claudia. In 1987, when she was 16 years old, Claudia became the victim of a violent attack. According to the available information, Eckert strangled her until she lost consciousness. Believing she was dead, he abandoned her. But Claudia survived. That single fact would prove enormously important. After recovering, she provided investigators with a description of her attacker. The information gave police something tangible to pursue. For years, Eckert had remained largely hidden behind the anonymity of his crimes. Now, for the first time, investigators had a witness capable of identifying him. The breakthrough became even more significant when a psychiatrist who had previously evaluated Eckert encountered the description. The similarities were striking enough to raise concern. The psychiatrist contacted authorities. The investigation began moving toward a suspect. Eventually, law enforcement focused their attention on Eckert. In 1988, he was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 12 years in prison. At first glance, it appeared that justice had finally caught up with him. Yet the reality was more complicated. The conviction addressed the attack on Claudia, but it did not reveal the full extent of his history. Sylvia Unterdorfel's death was still officially regarded as a suicide. Authorities still did not know that the man they had imprisoned for attempted murder had allegedly committed homicide more than a decade earlier. The deeper truth remained buried. During his imprisonment, Eckert received only limited psychological treatment. According to the information available, the efforts to address the underlying causes of his violent behavior were insufficient. This aspect of the case would later become a source of concern for investigators and observers alike. Could more extensive intervention have changed anything? Could a deeper understanding of his psychological issues have prevented future violence? Those questions remain impossible to answer with certainty. What is known is that the prison sentence eventually came to an end. In 1994, Eckert was released. He walked back into society as a free man. To many people, his story appeared finished. He had been convicted. He had served time. The legal process had run its course. But investigators would later conclude that a far more dangerous chapter was only beginning. The years following his release would transform the case from a regional criminal investigation into an international one. The teenager who had escaped accountability for murder had become an adult. The man convicted of attempted murder was now free again. And soon, he would find a profession that offered something investigators later described as nearly ideal for a predator seeking anonymity. A profession that would carry him across Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and beyond. A profession that would place countless vulnerable people directly in his path. The story of Volker Eckert's background is therefore not merely a biography. It is a warning. It is the story of how early warning signs evolved into violence, how a victim's death remained hidden for decades, and how a survivor's courage helped expose a dangerous offender. Most importantly, it is a reminder that behind every criminal case are real people whose lives were forever changed. Sylvia Unterdorfel never had the opportunity to tell her story. Claudia survived to help reveal the truth. And as the next chapter unfolds, more victims would unknowingly enter the orbit of a man whose crimes were about to expand far beyond the borders of a single German city. When Volker Eckert walked out of prison in 1994, the official record suggested that society had already dealt with him. He had been convicted for attempted murder. He had served his sentence. To many people, his criminal history appeared to belong to the past. Yet what authorities did not know was that the most dangerous phase of his life was still ahead. The years that followed would transform a regional offender into a suspect linked to crimes spanning multiple countries. The next chapter of the story would unfold not in a single city or even within a single nation, but across the highways of Europe. After his release, Eckert eventually moved to Hof. At first glance, his life may have appeared relatively ordinary. But in 1999, he entered a profession that would later become central to understanding how he managed to avoid detection for so long. He became an international truck driver. For most people, trucking is demanding and often lonely work. Drivers spend countless hours on the road, crossing vast distances to transport goods between cities and countries. Their schedules are dictated by delivery deadlines. Their lives are structured around highways, border crossings, rest stops, and loading docks. It is a profession that keeps economies moving. For investigators looking back at the Eckert case, however, trucking represented something else. It provided freedom. It provided mobility. And perhaps most importantly, it provided anonymity. A truck driver crossing from Germany into France is not unusual. A truck appearing in Spain one week and Italy the next attracts little attention. Long-distance transportation depends on constant movement. Thousands of drivers travel the same routes every day. For a man intent on hiding criminal activity, this environment offered extraordinary advantages. Years later, investigators would describe the profession as almost a perfect cover. Eckert could encounter someone in one country, travel hundreds of kilometers, and appear somewhere entirely different within a short period of time. If a victim disappeared in one jurisdiction and a body was discovered in another, connecting those events became far more difficult. Different police agencies handled different investigations. Different countries maintained different records. Communication between jurisdictions was not always immediate or comprehensive. The highways that connected Europe also created opportunities for crimes to become disconnected from one another. According to the evidence later uncovered, Eckert began targeting women involved in prostitution. Many of these women were already living in vulnerable circumstances. Some were migrants. Some were working far from their families. Many occupied positions on the margins of society, where disappearances could go unnoticed for longer periods than they otherwise might. This reality became one of the most tragic aspects of the case. The victims were not merely names in police files. They were individuals navigating difficult lives, often facing economic hardship, instability, or social isolation. Their vulnerability made them attractive targets for a predator seeking victims who might be less likely to generate immediate, coordinated investigations across multiple countries. According to later admissions, Eckert used a recurring method. He would bring victims into his truck. At some point, he would strangle them. The violence reflected patterns already seen in his earlier crimes and attacks. Strangulation remained central to his behavior. Control remained central to his behavior. The obsessions that had followed him since childhood remained central to his behavior. Yet the crimes did not end with death. One of the most disturbing discoveries investigators later made involved what occurred afterward. According to the evidence uncovered during the investigation, Eckert photographed the bodies of victims and kept the images as trophies, rather than attempting to erase every trace of the crimes from his memory. He preserved reminders of them. The photographs became personal records of violence. Investigators would later discover numerous Polaroid images documenting victims after death. The existence of those photographs offered a disturbing glimpse into the way Eckert viewed his crimes. For many offenders, trophies serve as a means of reliving experiences long after the event itself has ended. In Eckert's case, Authorities believe that the photographs allowed him to revisit the sense of control and domination associated with the crimes. The photographs were not the only items he kept. Investigators would later discover locks of hair, clothing, personal belongings, objects taken from victims and stored over long periods of time. Among all of these items, the preserved hair stood out as particularly significant. The connection between these trophies and Eckert's childhood fixation was impossible to ignore. The obsession that investigators traced back to his earliest years appeared repeatedly throughout. The evidence recovered after his arrest. As authorities pieced together the timeline, a series of confirmed victims emerged. Among them was Sandra Osifo, killed in France in 2001. Then came Beatriz Diaz in Spain, also in 2001. Several years later, Ahio Gali was killed in Italy in 2004. Marie Veselova was murdered in Spain in 2005. Agnes Cabas was killed in France in 2006. And finally, Miglina Petrova was murdered in Spain in 2006. Each name represented a life interrupted. Each victim left behind unanswered questions, grieving relatives, and communities forced to confront loss. What makes the list particularly haunting is its geographic spread. France, Spain, Italy, multiple jurisdictions, multiple investigative systems, multiple languages. At first glance, these cases did not necessarily appear connected. A homicide investigator in one country might have little reason to suspect that a similar crime, hundreds of kilometers away, involved the same offender. Without a clear link, each case risked remaining isolated. This challenge would become one of the defining features of the investigation. The modern world allows people to travel farther and faster than ever before. Yet law enforcement agencies often remain constrained by national boundaries, legal procedures, and administrative systems. Criminals who operate internationally can exploit those gaps. Investigators later concluded that Eckert benefited enormously from this reality. His movements across Europe mirrored the routes of legitimate commerce. Every trip appeared routine. Every border crossing appeared normal. Nothing about a truck moving between countries automatically suggests criminal activity. For years, the pattern remained hidden. One victim was discovered in one place. Another victim appeared somewhere else. Cases accumulated, but the broader picture remained incomplete. The tragedy of this period lies not only in the crimes themselves, but also in the silence surrounding them. Many of the victims lived lives that did not attract widespread media attention. Their disappearances did not always generate immediate international cooperation. Some families waited for answers that never arrived. Some investigations struggled to develop meaningful leads. Meanwhile, the person responsible continued driving across Europe. The roads became his workplace. The truck became both transportation and crime scene. The borders that separated nations became obstacles for investigators rather than obstacles for the offender. As years passed, the number of victims grew. Authorities would later debate exactly how many women Eckert had killed. Some estimates suggested 9 victims. Other investigators believed the true number might be significantly higher. What remained beyond dispute was the fact that multiple women lost their lives while he continued, traveling freely from country to country. The murders also revealed a chilling consistency. Despite the changing locations, the changing victims, and the changing circumstances, certain elements remained constant. Strangulation, control, the preservation of trophies, the fixation on hair. These recurring features would later help investigators recognize that they were dealing not with unrelated crimes, but with a single offender whose behavior followed a recognizable pattern. Yet, even as evidence accumulated in different corners of Europe, the breakthrough remained elusive. No matter how carefully detectives worked individual cases, they still lacked the piece that would eventually unite everything. That piece would emerge in 2006. Ironically, after years of avoiding capture, the beginning of Eckert's downfall would come not from an elaborate undercover operation, a confession, or a witness who recognized him. It would begin with something far simpler. A camera, a single recording, a small detail captured near the location where one of his final victims was discovered. After years of operating across international borders, after decades of violence stretching back to his teenage years, the system that had protected him through anonymity was about to fail. And once investigators began pulling on that thread, they would uncover a hidden history of violence far larger than anyone had imagined. The roads that had carried Volker Eckert across Europe for years were finally leading him toward the end of his freedom. For years, Volker Eckert had benefited from a combination of mobility, anonymity, and circumstance. His profession allowed him to cross borders with ease. His victims were scattered across multiple countries. Many lived vulnerable lives that made their disappearances difficult to connect. Individual investigations emerged, but the larger picture remained hidden. Law enforcement agencies were often looking at separate pieces of the same puzzle without realizing they belonged together. Yet history has shown that even the most careful offenders eventually make mistakes. Sometimes those mistakes are dramatic. Sometimes they are astonishingly small. In the case of Volker Eckert, the beginning of the end came from a detail so ordinary that it might easily have been overlooked. The year was 2006. By this point, Eckert had spent years traveling European highways as an international truck driver. Investigators would later suspect that multiple murders had already occurred during this period. Yet despite the growing number of victims, authorities had not succeeded in identifying a single offender responsible for the crimes. Then came the murder of Miglina Petrova. Miglina Petrova was a 20-year-old woman from Bulgaria. Like the other women linked to the case, she was more than a name in a police report. She was a person with a life, a history, and people who cared about her. Yet on November 2nd, 2006, she became the final known victim connected to Eckert's crimes. According to the available information, Eckert killed Miglina in Spain. For him, it likely appeared to be another crime that would remain hidden among countless kilometers of highway and international travel. But this time something went wrong. While disposing of the body near a parking area, a surveillance camera captured an image that would ultimately change everything. The recording showed Eckert's truck near the location where Miglina's body was discovered. At first glance, the footage may not have seemed extraordinary. Trucks are expected to be near parking areas. Commercial vehicles travel constantly. Yet investigators examining the evidence recognized the potential importance of what they were seeing. Unlike previous cases, they now possess something concrete. A vehicle, a location, a timeline, and most importantly, a possible connection between all three. Investigators in Catalonia began examining the footage carefully. Every detail mattered. Modern criminal investigations often advance through patient analysis rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Detectives review recordings, compare information, verify registrations, and follow trails that sometimes lead nowhere. This trail led somewhere. Authorities identified the truck captured on the surveillance footage. From there, they traced the registration. The vehicle belonged to a German driver. Suddenly, what had initially appeared to be a local investigation began expanding beyond national borders. The discovery immediately raised new questions. Why had the truck been near the location where Miglina Petrova's body was found? Who had been driving it? Could the vehicle's presence be explained through legitimate business activities? Or had investigators finally identified a suspect connected to a much larger series of crimes? The answers would emerge rapidly. As police pursued the lead, they focused their attention on Volker Eckert. The investigation that followed demonstrated the importance of international cooperation. Because the potential suspect was located in Germany while the crime under investigation had occurred in Spain, authorities needed to coordinate across jurisdictions. Information had to be exchanged, evidence had to be reviewed, legal procedures had to be followed. Years earlier, such coordination might have moved much more slowly. Now, investigators worked together to determine whether they had finally found the person responsible. On November 17, 2006, just 15 days after Miglina Petrova's murder, Volker Eckert was arrested in Wesseling, near Cologne, under an international warrant. For the first time, the man who had spent decades avoiding accountability was in custody. Yet the arrest itself was only the beginning. What investigators would discover next would transform the case from a single homicide investigation into one of the most disturbing serial murder inquiries in modern European criminal history. Following the arrest, authorities searched Eckert's truck. Investigators entering the suspect's vehicle often hoped to find evidence connecting the individual to a specific crime. They searched for documents, physical traces, personal items, or anything capable of establishing a link between suspect and victim. What they found exceeded those expectations dramatically. Inside the truck, authorities discovered numerous Polaroid photographs depicting deceased women. The significance of the photographs was immediate. These were not random images. They appeared to document victims after death. For investigators, the photographs represented potential evidence connecting Eckert not only to Miglina Petrova, but also to other crimes that remained unsolved. The discovery alone was deeply disturbing. But it was not the only thing they found. Investigators also uncovered locks of hair. Hair carefully preserved and retained over time. The finding immediately drew attention because it corresponded so closely with behavioral patterns that would later emerge from the broader investigation. Authorities additionally discovered clothing and personal belongings believed to have belonged to victims. Items that should have remained with the women who owned them had instead been retained by the suspect. Each object represented a possible connection to another crime. Each object potentially belonged to someone whose case remained unresolved. As investigators continued their search, they uncovered written records and notes documenting aspects of Eckert's activities. The evidence suggested organization rather than impulsiveness. More importantly, it suggested that the scale of the case might be far greater than originally suspected. The search did not end with the truck. Authorities also examined Eckert's residence. There, additional evidence reinforced growing fears that investigators had uncovered a serial offender whose crimes stretched across multiple countries and many years. The discoveries painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Photographs, hair, clothing, personal belongings, records, evidence indicating repeated criminal behavior rather than a single isolated event. As news of the arrest spread through law enforcement circles, agencies in multiple countries began reviewing unsolved cases. The implications were enormous. If Eckert had committed murders in several nations, investigators would need to compare evidence gathered over many years by different police departments operating under different legal systems. The challenge was immense, but so was the potential importance. Authorities in France examined whether unresolved cases within their jurisdiction might be connected. Investigators in Spain revisited existing files. Italian authorities reviewed information related to victims discovered there. Additional scrutiny extended into other regions where unsolved disappearances and murders shared similarities with the developing profile. What had begun as an investigation into the murder of Miglina Petrova was rapidly becoming an international effort. One of the most significant developments was the formation of a multinational investigative process designed to compare evidence across borders. This represented a crucial turning point. For years, geography had worked in Eckert's favor. Now geography was working against him. Information that had once existed in separate files was being brought together. Patterns became easier to recognize. Connections became harder to ignore. Victims who once appeared unrelated increasingly seemed linked by a common offender. As investigators compared evidence, a clearer picture emerged. The confirmed victims already identified were only part of the story. Authorities began questioning whether additional unsolved murders might also be connected. The possibility was deeply troubling. Every new photograph raised questions. Every recovered belonging raised questions. Every record found during the searches raised questions. How many victims were there? How many crimes had gone unnoticed? How many families were still waiting for answers? Investigators could not yet provide definitive numbers. What they could say was that the evidence suggested a far broader pattern than anyone initially understood. The discoveries also highlighted the tragic vulnerability of many of the victims. Several were women engaged in prostitution. Some were migrants living far from home. Their disappearances had not always generated large-scale international investigations at the time. They occurred. Now, years later, authorities were attempting to reconstruct events that stretched across an entire continent. The task was difficult. Some evidence had aged. Some witnesses were no longer available. Some cases contained gaps that might never be filled. Yet despite those challenges, the investigation continued building momentum. The arrest of Volker Eckert had transformed uncertainty into possibility. For the first time, investigators possessed a suspect. For the first time, they possessed physical evidence suggesting connections among multiple crimes. For the first time, they could begin asking questions directly to the man they believed was responsible. Those questions would soon produce answers. Not all of them, but enough to reveal that the horrors hidden behind years of highway travel were even greater than authorities had feared. In the months following his arrest, Eckert would begin speaking with investigators. And what he admitted would force authorities to revisit crimes stretching all the way back to a 14-year-old girl whose death had been mistaken for suicide more than 3 decades earlier. The breakthrough had finally arrived. But the full truth was only beginning to emerge. When investigators arrested Volker Eckert in November 2006, they knew they had uncovered something significant. The evidence recovered from his truck and residence suggested a pattern of violence extending far beyond a single homicide. Photographs, personal belongings, locks of hair, and written records all pointed toward a criminal history that appeared both extensive and deeply disturbing. Yet even with those discoveries, authorities still faced a critical challenge. They needed to determine exactly how many victims there were, which crimes could be conclusively linked to Eckert, and how much of the truth he was willing to reveal. The answers would emerge gradually through interviews, evidence analysis, and cooperation among investigative agencies across Europe. For the families of victims, every new discovery carried the possibility of long-awaited answers. For investigators, every admission had the potential to solve cases that had remained mysteries for years. And for Volker Eckert himself, the period following his arrest marked the first time in decades that he could no longer hide behind distance, mobility, or anonymity. As questioning continued, Eckert began making admissions. Confessions in criminal investigations are often complicated. Investigators must compare statements against physical evidence, witness accounts, and established facts. A confession alone is rarely enough. It must be tested against what is already known. In Eckert's case, authorities approached his statements carefully, examining whether his admissions matched details that only the perpetrator would know. According to the available information, Eckert ultimately admitted responsibility for 6 murders. Among those admissions was one of the most significant revelations in the entire investigation. He confessed to killing Sylvia on her doorful. More than 30 years had passed since her death in 1974. For decades, her case had remained classified as a suicide. Now investigators finally had an explanation for what had actually happened. The 14-year-old girl whose death had puzzled some observers for years had not taken her own life. According to Eckert's admission, she had been murdered. The confession transformed the understanding of his criminal history. Authorities no longer viewed his violence as something that emerged during adulthood. Instead, the timeline stretched all the way back to adolescence. The first known killing had occurred when he was only 14 years old. For investigators, this revelation was extraordinary. Few serial offenders begin killing at such a young age. Even more unusual was the fact that the crime had remained hidden for more than 3 decades before. The truth emerged. The admission also carried profound significance for Sylvia's family. Although no confession can undo a loss, knowing what truly happened can provide a measure of clarity that years of uncertainty cannot. Yet even as investigators documented Eckert's admissions, they remained convinced that the full story had not yet been told. The evidence recovered during the investigation suggested a broader pattern than the 6 murders he acknowledged. Authorities in Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and the Czech Republic continued examining unsolved cases that shared similarities with the crimes already linked to him. The numbers varied depending on the source and the specific stage of the investigation. But many investigators believe the true victim count was significantly higher than 6. Some estimates suggested at least 13 victims. Others placed the figure as high as 19. The challenge, however, was proving those connections beyond doubt. Each suspected victim required evidence. Each case required careful examination. And many of the crimes had occurred years earlier, often in different countries and under different investigative circumstances. As a result, authorities faced the difficult task of reconstructing events that stretched across decades and international borders. The process was painstaking. Investigators compared photographs to missing person reports. They examined recovered belongings. They reviewed timelines. They searched for evidence capable of linking individual victims to Eckert with certainty. The work represented one of the largest and most complex phases of the investigation. Yet amid the growing evidence, one statement from Eckert attracted particular attention. At some point after his arrest, he reportedly remarked, "I was crazy enough to feel relieved that I had been caught." The statement quickly became one of the most widely cited aspects of the case. Its meaning has been debated by observers ever since. Some viewed it as an acknowledgement of the psychological burden created by years of criminal behavior. Others interpreted it as an attempt to explain his actions after the fact. Regardless of interpretation, the remark reflected the unusual circumstances surrounding the investigation. After decades of secrecy, mobility, and deception, the man at the center of the case was finally confronting the consequences of his actions. For victims' families, however, the focus remained elsewhere. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. And they wanted justice. The next step was supposed to be a trial. Prosecutors began assembling what promised to be an enormous case. Evidence had to be organized. International findings had to be coordinated. Witnesses had to be identified. Investigators continued working to establish links between Eckert and additional victims. The legal process was expected to be lengthy and complex. Given the international nature of the crimes, the proceedings would likely have attracted significant public attention. The trial also represented something important for families. Trials serve many purposes. They determine guilt under the law. They establish official records. They allow evidence to be presented publicly. And, perhaps most importantly, for victims' relatives, they provide an opportunity to hear the facts acknowledged in a formal setting. Many families hoped the proceedings would answer questions that had lingered for years. How many victims were there? What exactly had happened? Were there additional crimes still waiting to be uncovered? Investigators believe the upcoming legal process might help resolve at least some of those questions. But events took an unexpected turn before the trial could begin. On July 2, 2007, authorities discovered Volker Eckert dead inside his prison cell in Bayreuth, Bavaria. The timing was striking. The discovery occurred just one day after his 48th birthday. According to available information, Eckert had taken his own life. He used a piece of fabric attached to a television bracket inside the cell. With that act, the legal proceedings came to an abrupt end. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. From a legal perspective, the planned trial could no longer move forward. The opportunity to present evidence in open court disappeared. The possibility of additional confessions disappeared. Any chance of questioning Eckert about unresolved cases disappeared. For investigators, the death represented a major setback. Although substantial evidence had already been gathered, many questions remained unanswered. There were still cases under review. There were still victims whose connection to Eckert had not been conclusively established. There were still uncertainties regarding the true scope of his crimes. Now, the person most capable of clarifying those questions was gone. For victims' families, the situation was equally frustrating. Some families had hoped for direct accountability. Others had hoped to hear explanations. Many simply wanted certainty. Instead, they were left with an investigation that had advanced dramatically but stopped short of a full judicial conclusion. The absence of a trial also affected the historical record of the case. Trials create detailed public accounts through testimony, evidence presentation, and judicial findings. Without that process, some aspects of the investigation remained unresolved. Authorities could still examine evidence. They could still reach investigative conclusions. But certain questions would never receive answers from the man responsible. In many ways, this outcome reflected one of the recurring themes throughout the entire case. From the beginning, uncertainty had played a central role. Sylvia Unner-Dorfel's death was misidentified for decades. Multiple victims were separated by geography and jurisdiction. Investigators spent years attempting to connect crimes that initially appeared unrelated. And now, just as the legal process approached its most significant phase, another source of uncertainty emerged. How much had Eckert taken to the grave with him? No one could say for certain. What investigators did know was that the evidence already collected painted a disturbing picture. It revealed a man whose violent behavior stretched back to adolescence. It revealed a series of murders committed across multiple countries. It revealed a pattern of trophy-taking and post-mortem behavior that shocked even experienced investigators. And it revealed how effectively an offender could exploit mobility and international travel to conceal criminal activity. The prosecution phase of the Volker Eckert case never reached the courtroom conclusion many had expected. There would be no lengthy trial. No final verdict delivered after weeks of testimony. No opportunity for prosecutors to present every detail before a judge. Instead, the case ended in a prison cell. Yet although the legal proceedings ended, the impact of the investigation did not. Across Europe, investigators continued examining unresolved questions. Families continued searching for answers. and the broader implications of the case continued to influence discussions about serial crime, cross-border investigations, and the protection of vulnerable victims. The death of Volker Eckert closed one chapter of the story, but did not close all of them. In many respects, the most enduring questions were still waiting to be confronted. When people think about serial killer cases, there is often an expectation of closure. An arrest is made, a trial is held, evidence is presented, a verdict is delivered, questions are answered, families finally receive some measure of certainty. Yet the case of Volker Eckert never followed that path. By the time authorities uncovered the true scope of his crimes, many of the answers they sought remained trapped inside the mind of the man responsible. His death in prison on July 2nd, 2007 brought an end to the legal proceedings. But it did not bring an end to the investigation's most troubling questions. In many ways, the aftermath of the case became just as significant as the crimes themselves. One of the most enduring mysteries concerns the true number of victims. Officially, Eckert admitted responsibility for 6 murders. Investigators connected him to multiple victims across Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. Yet authorities in several countries believe the actual number could be considerably higher. Estimates range from 9 victims to as many as 19. The gap between those numbers represents more than a statistical uncertainty. It represents real people. Each unidentified victim would have had a family, friends, memories, ambitions, and a life interrupted by violence. Every unresolved case carries emotional consequences for those left behind. The uncertainty surrounding the final victim count means that some families may never know whether their loved one crossed paths with Volker Eckert. That uncertainty remains one of the most painful aspects of the entire story. Investigators recovered photographs. They recovered personal belongings. They recovered records and evidence suggesting a broader pattern of offending. Yet evidence alone cannot always answer every question. Without a trial and without further interviews, some conclusions remain beyond reach. As a result, the final chapter of the case became defined not by certainty, but by absence. The absence of answers. The absence of complete accountability. The absence of a definitive conclusion. For the families of known victims, the situation was deeply complicated. The arrest of Eckert provided confirmation that a suspect had been identified. His admissions helped clarify some long-standing mysteries. Sylvia Unterdorfel's family, for example, finally learned that her death had not been a suicide. More than 30 years after she was killed, the truth emerged. But truth and closure are not the same thing. Closure is often discussed in criminal cases as though it arrives automatically once an offender is identified. In reality, many families continue to struggle with grief regardless of legal outcomes. In cases like this one, where the offender dies before trial, the sense of incompleteness can be particularly difficult. Questions remain. What else would he have admitted? How many victims were there? Were there crimes investigators never discovered? Could additional families have finally received answers if the trial had proceeded? Those questions continue to echo through discussions of the case. The investigation also exposed significant challenges facing law enforcement in an increasingly interconnected world. Volker Eckert operated across multiple countries: Germany, France, Spain, Italy, potentially others. Each nation possessed its own investigative procedures, legal frameworks, and police agencies. While international cooperation has improved significantly over time, the Eckert case demonstrated how difficult it can be to connect crimes that occur across national borders. A homicide in one country may initially appear unrelated to a disappearance in another. Different investigators may examine different pieces of evidence. Information can remain fragmented. Patterns can remain hidden. For years, geography worked in Eckert's favor. The very roads that connected Europe economically also created opportunities for criminal movement. As a truck driver, he could travel vast distances while appearing entirely ordinary. Nothing about his occupation immediately attracted suspicion. Thousands of other drivers followed similar routes every day. Investigators later recognized that this mobility was one of the key factors that allowed him to avoid detection for so long. The case therefore became an important example of why cross-border cooperation matters. When information remains isolated, offenders can exploit those gaps. When agencies communicate effectively, patterns become easier to identify. The lessons learned from investigations like this one continue to influence modern approaches to international crime. Another important aspect of the case involves the role of survivors. Throughout history, many major criminal investigations have depended upon the testimony of individuals who managed to escape violence. In the Eckert case, Claudia's survival in 1987 proved enormously significant. Had she not survived, investigators might never have obtained the description that helped identify him at that stage of his life. Her experience serves as a reminder that survivors are often among the most important participants in the pursuit of justice. They provide information that cannot be obtained elsewhere. They help reconstruct events, and in many cases, they help prevent future violence. The importance of Claudia's survival becomes even clearer when viewed within the broader timeline of the case. By the time Eckert was arrested in 2006, investigators would discover that violence had accompanied him for decades. The attack she survived became one of the earliest opportunities to expose him. The case also forces difficult conversations about vulnerable victims. Many of the women linked to Eckert were involved in prostitution. Several were migrants. Some lived far from family support systems. These circumstances did not make their lives less valuable. Yet historically, vulnerable populations have often faced greater risks and fewer protections. Their disappearances may receive less attention. Their cases may attract fewer resources. Their stories may be overlooked. One of the most important lessons from the Volker-Eckert investigation is the need to resist that tendency. Every victim matters. Every disappearance deserves attention. Every life deserves equal concern regardless of profession, nationality, economic status, or social circumstances. The women targeted by Eckert were not statistics. Sandra Osifo was a person. Beatriz Diaz was a person. Ahio Gali was a person. Marie Veselova was a person. Agnieszka Boss was a person. Miglina Petrova was a person. Silvia Unterdorfer was a person. Each had a life that existed long before they became associated with a criminal investigation. Each deserved safety. Each deserved a future. And each deserves to be remembered as more than a victim. Perhaps that is why the most meaningful way to examine this case is not through fascination with the offender, but through reflection on those whose lives were affected by his actions. Volker-Eckert's story contains many elements that attract public attention. A serial killer operating across Europe. A truck driver moving unnoticed between countries. Photographs hidden for years. Trophies collected from victims. An arrest triggered by surveillance footage. A confession. A suicide before trial. These details are dramatic, but they are not the heart of the story. The heart of the story is loss. It is the loss experienced by families. The loss experienced by communities. The loss experienced by victims whose futures were taken away. When investigators searched Eckert's truck and residence, they found objects that he had preserved as trophies. To him, those items may have represented memories of crimes. To investigators, however, they represented something very different. They represented human beings. Evidence bags and photographs may seem impersonal, But behind every piece of evidence stands a real person whose life mattered. That distinction is important. True crime stories sometimes risk focusing so heavily on offenders that victims fade into the background. The Volker Eckert case serves as a reminder that the opposite approach is necessary. The killer's actions explain what happened. The victims explain why it matters. Even today, years after the investigation, questions remain unresolved. The exact number of victims may never be known. Some cases may never be conclusively linked to Eckert. Some families may never receive the certainty they hoped for. Those unresolved questions form part of the case's legacy. But they are not its entire legacy. The investigation also demonstrated the power of persistence. A death misclassified in 1974 was eventually re-examined. A survivor's testimony helped expose a dangerous offender. Investigators from multiple countries shared information and pursued connections across borders. A surveillance camera captured a detail that ultimately changed everything. Piece by piece, a hidden history was brought into the light. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth returning to the image that opened it. The highways of Europe continue to carry thousands of trucks every day. Drivers still cross borders. Goods still move between nations. Most journeys remain entirely ordinary. Yet hidden within those endless roads was a story that unfolded over more than 3 decades. A story of violence, missed opportunities, determination, and loss. Volker Eckert is remembered as one of Germany's most notorious serial killers because of the scale of his crimes, the international scope of his movements, and the disturbing evidence uncovered after his arrest. But notoriety is not the most important thing to remember. The most important thing to remember is the people whose lives intersected with his. The young girl whose death remained misunderstood for decades. The survivor whose courage helped expose the truth. The women whose names appeared in investigative files spread across Europe. And the families who spent years searching for answers. Their stories are the reason this case continues to matter. Because while the highways eventually carried Volker Eckert to the end of his journey, the consequences of his actions did not end with him. They remain in the memories of those left behind, in the lessons learned by investigators, and in the unanswered questions that continue to linger long after the case itself came to an end. On July 2, 2007, the story of Volker Eckert came to an end inside a prison cell in Bayreuth, Bavaria. One day earlier, he had turned 48 years old. Before prosecutors could present the full case against him in court, before investigators could finish examining every lead, before many families could hear all of the answers they had spent years waiting for, the man at the center of the investigation took his own life. In practical terms, the death of a suspect closes certain doors forever. A dead suspect cannot be questioned. A dead suspect cannot explain missing details. A dead suspect cannot identify unknown victims. And a dead suspect cannot reveal which crimes he did or did not commit. For investigators, that reality became one of the most frustrating aspects of the entire case. When authorities first arrested Eckert in November 2006, they believed they had finally found the person responsible for a series of murders that stretched across Europe. The evidence appeared overwhelming. The photographs, the trophies, the personal belongings, the admissions he eventually made. Every new discovery seemed to reveal another layer of a hidden history that had remained concealed for decades. Yet even then, investigators suspected they were seeing only part of the picture. The challenge was determining how large the picture really was. Officially, Eckert admitted to 6 murders. Investigators linked him to multiple victims in France, Spain, and Italy. Authorities also established his responsibility for the killing of Sylvia Unterdorfel, The 14-year-old classmate whose death had been mistaken for suicide for more than 30 years. But beyond those known victims lay uncertainty. Police agencies in several countries continued examining unsolved cases. Some investigators believed the true number of victims could be substantially higher. Others remained cautious, insisting that every suspected connection required evidence. The result was a range of estimates that has remained attached to the case ever since. Was the total number 9? Was it 13? Was it 19? Or was the real number something that investigators would never discover? No definitive answer emerged, and perhaps none ever will. The uncertainty is important because criminal investigations are ultimately about more than identifying offenders. They are also about restoring identities to victims. Every unresolved case represents a human being. Every unidentified victim represents a family waiting for answers. Every unanswered question leaves a space that evidence alone cannot fully fill. For some families, the arrest of Eckert provided a measure of clarity. For others, it created new questions. Could their missing daughter have been one of his victims? Could a loved one's unsolved murder somehow connect to the investigation? Was there evidence that had not yet been discovered? Those questions became harder to answer after his death. The investigation did not stop immediately. Authorities continued reviewing files, comparing evidence, and examining potential links to other crimes, but without the possibility of additional confessions or further interviews. Certain avenues of inquiry were permanently lost. In that sense, the case remains incomplete. Not incomplete because investigators failed. Not incomplete because evidence was lacking. Incomplete because the person who possessed the most knowledge about the crimes chose to take much of that knowledge with him. There is another reason the Volker-Eckert case continues to attract attention years after the investigation ended. It illustrates how easily modern mobility can complicate criminal investigations. For decades, Eckert traveled international routes as a truck driver. The same highways used for legitimate commerce became pathways that connected multiple crime scenes. The same freedom of movement enjoyed by millions of ordinary citizens helped conceal a predator, moving between countries. Nothing about a truck crossing a border is unusual. Nothing about a driver stopping at a rest area automatically raises suspicion. The routine nature of those activities helped him blend into the background. Only years later did investigators begin to see how effectively he had used that environment. The case demonstrated the difficulties law enforcement agencies face when crimes cross national boundaries. A victim may disappear in one country. Evidence may emerge in another. A suspect may live somewhere else entirely. Without cooperation, important connections can remain hidden. The Volker-Eckert investigation became an example of why international collaboration is essential in modern criminal justice. Information that seems insignificant in one jurisdiction may become crucial when combined with evidence from another. Patterns often emerge only when separate investigations are viewed together. In many respects, that was exactly what happened here. Individual cases gradually transformed into a broader understanding of serial offender whose activities extended across much of Europe. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the case is not the geography. It is the timeline. According to the information uncovered after his arrest, Eckert's first known murder occurred in 1974. He was 14 years old. More than 3 decades passed before that crime was finally connected to him. 30 years. An entire generation. During that period, lives changed, families grew older, and investigators came and went. All the while, the truth remained hidden. Looking back, it is impossible not to wonder how different events might have been if Sylvia Unterdorfel's death had been correctly identified as a homicide in 1974. Would future victims have been spared? Would later crimes have occurred? Would investigators have discovered the pattern much sooner? Those questions belong to a category of inquiry that can never be answered with certainty. History offers no opportunity for revision. What happened cannot be undone. The victims cannot be brought back. The years cannot be recovered. All that remains is the record of what occurred and the lessons that can be learned from it. One of those lessons concerns the importance of taking violence seriously, even when evidence appears limited. Another concerns the protection of vulnerable populations. Many of the women linked to Eckert lived on the margins of society. Some were migrants. Some were engaged in sex work. Their vulnerability did not make them less important. If anything, it made them more deserving of attention and protection. The case serves as a reminder that every victim matters, regardless of social status or circumstance. It also reminds us that serial offenders often rely upon invisibility, not their own invisibility, but the invisibility of the people they target. When victims are overlooked, offenders gain opportunities. When victims are remembered, identified, and investigated thoroughly, those opportunities shrink. Ultimately, the legacy of the Volker-Eckert case is not contained in the name of the offender. His life ended in a prison cell. His explanations ended with him. His future disappeared the moment he chose to end it. The lasting legacy belongs elsewhere. It belongs to Sylvia Unterdorfel. It belongs to Sandra Osifo. It belongs to Beatriz Diaz. It belongs to Ahio Gali. It belongs to Marie Veselova. It belongs to Agnieszka Boss. It belongs to Miglina Petrova. And it belongs to every victim whose connection to the case may never be fully established. These are the people whose stories give the investigation its meaning. These are the lives that transformed a criminal case into a human tragedy. And these are the names that deserve to be remembered long after the name Volker-Eckert becomes nothing more than a footnote in the history of European crime. Because at the end of every true crime story, after the headlines fade and the investigations close, what remains are not the crimes themselves. What remains are the people who should have had more time, the people whose futures were taken, and the enduring responsibility to remember them.